So let's create the login method so that we can have a user login and then provide them with a JSON Web Token. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this method here, and I'm just going to paste it up here. And this is going to be mapping to login, and it's also going to take a user. We're only going to be using the username and the password. So let's remove this whole thing and let's call another method. So let's call this method called authenticate. And this method is gonna take the username and the password. So we're gonna do user get username, and we're gonna do user that get password. Okay, so we're gonna be creating this method. This is the method that's gonna actually do the authentication. So let's go ahead and create this method. So if anything fails during the authentication, this method right here will throw an exception. So it won't even, go into the next line. If something is wrong, the credential is incorrect or the password is incorrect, this will throw the an exception, and the response will be sent back to the user. So it won't even make it to the next line. So if they authenticated successfully, then we can create a user. So let's call it login user. And here we're gonna call the user service and then find user by username. And then here we're gonna pass the username again. Okay, so that way we can actually get the user that actually just authenticated, okay, from here. So once we have the user, we can actually create a user principal. So it's the user principal, and we actually gonna call the constructor and pass in the user. Well, we need to pass in the login user. Okay, so that way we have a user principal because it only takes the user object, which we have here. So once we have that, then we can generate the headers for the JSON Web Token. So here we can do HTTP headers, and that's gonna be, well, let's call this JWT header because that's what it is. And let's create another method. Let's say get JWT headers or header, since it's only one. So this is gonna be this method, and it's gonna take the user principal. So it's gonna do user principal. So this method is gonna return the JSON Web Token headers that we need, and then in the response we're gonna return in the body the actual user. So the login user we found here, and also the headers. In the headers, we're gonna have the JSON Web Token. And then after that, we return on HTTP response of OK. So just to go over the flow again, we take the user information. So let me remove those. They're not being thrown right now. Okay, so we take the user information and then we pass this information to this method right here, which is a private method that I'm gonna build right now. So if anything is wrong with the authentication, meaning if they pass in a wrong username or the wrong password, or if their account is locked or disabled, then this method will throw an exception. So the code won't even make it to line 33 here. Otherwise, meaning if this is successful because it didn't throw an exception, then we will continue to find the user. So we'll call the user service find user by username, and then with that user we create a new principal, and then with that user principal we pass it in here to create the JWT header. So let's go ahead and create this method as well. So now we just have to complete this method. So for the authentication, we're gonna need to call the authentication manager. So let's bring this in. So here I'm gonna go and do private authentication manager, and we're gonna call it authentication manager. And we also gonna need the JSON Web Token provider. So let's do private JWT token provider. So token provider, and we're gonna call it token provider as well. And here we just need to create a constructor for those two new fields. So we have to select all three of them. And I don't need this anymore here. So I can just delete this and then paste it here. Okay. So we have our auto wire, and then we have the user service, authentication manager, and the JWT token provider. Okay, and we have those defined here as well. So now we can actually call this token provider, not the token provider, the authentication manager, and then authenticate the user. So what we have to do now, we're just gonna call the manager. So authentication manager dot authenticate. Okay, and then in here we're gonna pass in a new username, password, authentication token. So username, password, authentication token, and as you can see, this takes the principal and the credential. So here we're gonna pass in the username and the password. Okay, and this is just gonna do the trick for us. So this is gonna authenticate the user, and then throw an exception if the credentials are actually incorrect. And for the get JWT header, we just have to create some headers. So we're gonna do HTTP headers, and we're gonna call them headers, and that's gonna call the constructor. So once we have the headers, we can just add the JSON web token. So we're gonna do the headers, and we're gonna add a new token. So here we have to pass in the token name, or the name of the actual header, and the value. So here we're gonna pass in the JWT token header. So token header, and we're gonna pass in the actual header. So to pass in the header, we're gonna call in the JWT token provider that generate token, and then here we just pass in the principal. I'm just gonna call it user, and we're just gonna pass it in here. Okay, if you remember, if we go in here, you can see that in the token provider, this is expecting a user principal. It's gonna take that principal and then generate the actual JSON web token. So I can't import this and import. So this is coming from the security constant that we created a few lectures back. So this is the JSON web token is gonna be in this header, JWT token. So if we go back here now, we can just add those to the, well, we have to change this to login because this is no longer register. And I'm gonna move the private methods to the bottom. So I'm gonna cut those and put them here, and I think that's all we need to do for now. So, and of course we have to return the headers here. So this is gonna return all the headers for us. Let's see if I can format this, and this is gonna authenticate the user. So at this point, we should be ready to go ahead and test this endpoint and see if we can generate an actual token for the user. And if the credentials are incorrect, then we expect the appropriate response to be sent back to the user. So we're gonna go ahead and try that in the next lecture.